Okay, so today I just thought we would check in. I've been receiving your sequences, and I know you guys wanted to meet today so we can just kind of check in and share a little bit and see if you have any questions at this point. I know a lot of you have sent me your backbone sequences today as well, so I'm slowly going through them. I'll give you all feedback over the weekend if I haven't already. So the biggest things I wanted to highlight in this session regarding the sequencing work is first of all just being progressive in the sequence. So just being mindful that your prep poses aren't necessarily harder than your peak pose. So this is a thing that comes up all the time. And this is kind of why I wanted you guys to choose quite an intermediate to advanced pose to work with, just so you have more prep poses to kind of play with that would be easier than your final big pose. And of course, this way of sequencing is quite new for a lot of us as well. So it takes some getting used to, because we all have our kind of habitual ways of sequencing, right? So it takes us out of our comfort zone and makes us think a little bit differently how we would approach that. So do you guys have any questions at this point about your forward bend sequences or your back bend sequences at this point? Claire, you have a question.
I do actually. I actually wanted to know, with my overall sequence, am I going into too much detail? Am I going into too little detail? The whole thing, I went into panic there, because then, you remember, oh yes, this is just the sequence. So your warm-up is actually, your warm-up something over there, and your cool down something over there. You're not including it. You've just got to focus on like this little area. But then I remember you also saying, bring in blocks and whatever else. And then I was like, crikey Moses, at what point do I stop? Okay, you could use a strap, but you could also use, so how much detail are you really wanting us to dive into here? Was what I did okay? Did it like sort of, I don't know, there was anxiety that I was putting too much information. Like I was like, right, what can I put here?
And I think, Claire, that it was beautiful. Claire sent the most, there were pictures and hand-drawn pictures. Did you upload those pictures, drew them, and then put them into a document? It was amazing.
Yeah, I literally said I drew them on my paper. It helps that I'm into graphic design, so I literally drew them out, scanned them, pulled them into Photoshop, manipulated, cut them all, and then
it was the prettiest sequence I've ever gotten, and it was gorgeous. So I don't mind, because it always depends on your personalities. Like if you like Claire, she's going to want to do a whole lot around it because that's what makes her happy. And sometimes I don't mind just receiving like a list of like 12 poses as well. So it doesn't need to be complicated, but if you like sequencing that way, this whole project is for you anyway. So if it's something that's helpful for you, that you have it on file for later on, and you like to go through all of that, that's perfectly fine. I really don't mind. It takes me a little while because I'm like I was talking to Eva about it. I like to just read the list of poses, and it's normally my sequences are just like a list of Sanskrit words. And for me, that's just how I remember, and it works for me. Where I know you like to do the pictures, so I absolutely don't mind. Yeah. The biggest thing I'm looking at is those 12 to 16 prep poses. So I want to see that you took your pose, you broke it down, and then in your peak poses, you've tried to find the most similar shapes. So if you're doing Warrior 3, the pose you can find the most similar would be something like a high lunge, and then like a low lunge, and then maybe like a standing split or something like that. So they resemble the exact kind of shape as the peak pose as much as possible. And sometimes it'll just be the front leg. So maybe it would be pyramid. And sometimes if we're talking about Warrior 3 still, it'll be downward dog and the back leg will be up to resemble the back leg. So I just want to see that you've broken down the pose and you've kind of pieced all those components together. My internet is saying it's unstable. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
The
cool.
picture's a little bit off, but the voices come through.
Okay, just let me know if it goes off. So I'm mostly worried about those prep poses, but sometimes it filters through, and I have a look at your warm up as well, and I love it because it's so creative, and your minds work differently to my minds, and it's so cool to see.
Cool. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Firdaus.
Laura, the one thing that I found was that maybe it was just because of the pose I chose, that it seemed like a lot of it was very samey and there wasn't a lot of variety. So is that something that you would experience if we're just focusing on one thing, like back bend or forward bend or whatever? Or
Absolutely.
was my own simplicity?
Yes, so you're so right, Firdaus. You'll find in those 12 to 16 poses, it might not be very exciting. It might be really moving in the same direction. And that's totally fine because you're just kind of breaking down in an anatomy way. And then you'll make it more exciting with your transitions and your flow and a few other ways. Maybe like for me, I like to move around the mat a little bit, especially if it's like today, we really only focused on a few shapes. Then you can maybe change it up and make it more exciting with moving around your mat. And some poses definitely allow more shapes and more fun things to do when they have more kind of things going on. But like things like a standing split, which I think is what you did, Firdaus, if I remember correctly, you really are moving in one shape. So you'll find it almost seems quite boring. But when you're working through the poses slowly and you're refining and just moving in that shape, people actually find it quite nice just to focus on one movement and then boom, you land up in the peak pose. So it's also okay for it to not always be super fancy. I think it's also like a vinyasa mindset that we want to do like everything in one class. And now we're kind of like dialing it back to like just a few poses. So it's just a different way to kind of go about it. But yes, you're right. It does, you will move in the same direction. Totally. And I quite like that because it makes my classes so different. So if you taught that on Monday, on Wednesday you would teach maybe a hip opening class and it would be totally different poses. So instead of having all the poses in one class, every class you're kind of focusing in on one thing. So it's different, but not always. It depends on the pose. Janine, I saw your hand was up and now it's gone down and now she's okay. Just checking.
It was actually just, I think you answered my question. So, I mean, in our 16 poses, there are transition poses and we are moving. I mean, I always do move from the front to the back of the mat, but it's often difficult to put that in. So I think you've just clarified what you want. So I'm good.
I'm pretty much looking at the most boring level on how you've broken down the pose in your pose analysis breakdown and then how you found prep poses. And then sometimes you guys have sent me like the full sequence and I see how you've kind of merged that all together in a flow, which is also cool because it's helpful for you at the end of the day. Hopefully you're going to use these sequences and go out and teach them.
Super.
Okay. Can you still all hear me all right? I can see it's lagging a little bit. Are you all good? Okay. Just checking. I'm so nervous that the internet goes off. One more thing I wanted to bring up, and with these poses, like if we stick to our Warrior 3 example, try and really refine the movements that you're taking. So even though in Vinyasa we bring in all sorts of poses, so we'll move through Warrior 1, Warrior 2, side angle, in your peak pose sequencing, see if you can more refine it to just moving the body forwards if you're going into Warrior 3. So low lunge, high lunge, Warrior 3. Warrior 2 and side angle aren't necessarily going to help you get into Warrior 3, right? And I think it just takes us out of our normal Vinyasa mindset, how we like to kind of build poses and group them together. And now this is almost asking you to just focus in on one movement. flexion, and extension. So I know it kind of brings you out of your comfort zone a little bit, but see if you can refine it down just to the poses that are going to help you get into the peak pose. Does that make sense? So are there any questions with your poses, your forward bend poses and your back bend sequences and how we've broken it down? I can see today, after we've chatted a little bit about in your forward bends, how you've really refined that in your back bends. Yeah. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your back bend sequences as well, because when we do back bends, we think that doing a whole lot of back bends is going to be helpful to get into a bigger back bend, right? But not necessarily. What that's going to do, especially if you're doing lots of things like Shalabhasana and Cobra and those really active back bends where you're really contracting and using your back muscles, by the time you get into something like dances or full wheel or mermaid, you've actually tired out your back muscles quite a lot. So be mindful when it comes to back bends. The rules are kind of a little bit different, okay? More back bends doesn't mean a bigger back bend later on. It just means you're going to make your back quite tired. And for me, I mean, I love back bends, so I wouldn't mind, but a lot of people aren't comfortable doing loads of back bends. It can be quite a sticky point for us. Would you agree? My internet's saying it's unstable. Can you guys still hear me all right? Cara, you have a question?
Less a question than a comment. And by the way, yes, I can hear you all right, at least. Only the picture is frozen in between. With the back bends, I'm a bit torn. I understand the notion of like the back getting tired. But for example, in Berlin, there is this yoga teacher, and she is kind of like she focuses on back bends, and she teaches online classes via Zoom that are almost exclusively back bend classes. And she would warm up with like a few standing poses in like a hatha style. And then she would do back bend after back bend after back bend, and also repeating like the single back bends multiple times, let's say 3 times for like a high cobra and 3 times for like a camel, or and then even a lot more advanced variations. And it is tiring, but at the same time I feel like it also gives me the chance, because she focuses a lot on kind of like micro movements, especially like lifting the chest and working with the upper back. It feels like it actually helps me, the repetition of back bends, to get in deeper. So maybe that could also be kind of like an individual preference experience.
Absolutely, and I agree. I mean, totally. Do you like back bends as well, Cara?
They're difficult for me. They're difficult for me, and they often get me very emotional and sometimes very agitated. For example, in your back bend class the day before yesterday, I eventually had to switch the camera off because it got me like all emotional, and I was like just all around the room in a way. But yeah, I'm interested in working with them, because they're kind of like my weak spot, or they are the poses that I don't have the most access to, let's say. Let's put it like this.
Yeah. And I think it's a really what you were saying about in those back bends, how you could think about lifting and accessing in your upper back more from doing other similar kind of shapes. And maybe it's something just to be mindful that you can access those same sensations in something like low lunge and high lunge, which I think are such amazing places to really feel what we want to be doing with our spines, without having to be in a really big back bend, how we can think of that lengthening through the sides of the body and trying to access the upper back more, and talking about not sitting in the lower back but reaching up and back. So it's interesting. So just be maybe mindful of how we approach back bends. Thanks for sharing, Cara. Claire, you were next.
There we go, I'm on. So then with the back bend sort of thing, would you say like doing more twists and maybe rounded, that's still going to get the back like mobile and moving before we get into more of the, spine or whatever?
Exactly, Claire. So it challenges us to find other ways to kind of warm up the spine. So can we do a few kind of lateral stretches? Can we do a few gentle twists that we're warming up the spine in different ways as well, that we don't always have to bend backwards? And Catherine is is jumping in on the conversation, saying it depends on exactly the spinal extension in each back bend and what you would use to prep. So how would Cobra work for wheel? Thoracic extension has no spinal extension, only 35 degrees. So that's Catherine's take on it. So I agree. It also depends on the back bend. Sometimes it's helpful to do, and I'm not saying don't do any back bends. I mean, it's nice to move through your vinyasas of your cobras and maybe upward dog and working through that, but already that's quite a lot.
And then even the use of props, though, wouldn't that also, you could do those back bends, but if you've got the props in, then you're almost taking out the effort and the maybe the pain. Yes, back bends are also my kryptonite. I suffer, but like if you're putting in like your wheels or your blocks and whatnot, and you're going into like your bridges or just lying over the wheel, because you're using that prop and not so much the muscles, etc., that could also help in that sort of getting the spine mobile.
Exactly, Claire. So you can see in our back bend sequences we've done, we often start lying over the blocks. So more in a passive back bend where your back muscles are not having to engage or do anything, but you're just slowly lying there, releasing and opening up into those shapes. So absolutely, very helpful. For Dose.
I think you've sort of answered it, but I just want to double check. Exactly what everyone is saying about how you wouldn't necessarily do a lot of back bends to get into a back bend, which I would agree with. I wouldn't want to do that. But would you do a lot of like just a lunge with your arms up so there's like an extension, or would that also tire your back out?
I think lunges are quite a nice place, and I use them a lot, low lunge and high lunge, because you can really feel that extension with your arms and you're still moving into back bends, but maybe not as strong as something like camel pose, where you really, holding on to get back, which is quite a strenuous back bend. Or if you're doing lots of like bows and really compressing and, engaging your back bend. So I think low lunge and high lunge are a great place to try and access the sensation and actions and shapes and feelings you want in those bigger back bends without having to do things that feel quite strong in your back. Eva?
And then would you do a lot more rounding?
Sorry, for Dose, please finish.
Sorry. Would you do a lot, not a lot more, but would you do some rounding, like what Claire was saying, because you almost want to just get the spine moving?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially I was chatting to someone earlier today about doing quite a lot of shoulder work. So a lot of these big back bends, we can warm up the spine only to a certain point, and it only kind of goes as far as it goes at the end of the day, and we can warm up. But what we really need to focus on for a lot of these crazy big back bends is our shoulders. And how can we actually do more shoulder work and shoulder flexion work for things like full wheel and things where you're going back into full dances, and actually focusing less continuously on back, and we can do some spinal warming, but then it moves to, okay, what's happening in your shoulders? How can we stretch triceps? How can we stretch a little bit into lat and start to kind of warm up our shoulders more to move into these big shapes? And then think about your legs and your hips. Can we kind of focus more on the other limbs around the spine to help us with these back bends as well? That answer your question? Eva?
Yes, I'm totally with you with the shoulders, because that is probably for most of us the weakest point in the back bends, in those where the arms are overhead. But I still like to include some like baby back bends, not only in lunge, also where I really need to engage my back, even if it's tiring it out a bit, because I like to start with less motion and more strength in back bends, because once we go to the bigger back bends, the strength component of those backbends almost or often falls off the wagon, because then we use levers because we hold the legs or we push into the ground or whatever. So just to strengthen the back muscles as well, I like to include some of those poses like Shalabhasana or like baby cobras, even without the hands, to engage the muscles in the back.
Yeah. And I think it's totally fine doing baby back bends, totally cool, but maybe just not a whole hour of full-on back bends is more kind of what I would advise you guys around. But yeah, totally. Lauren, you were next.
Hi, I should remember to unmute me for once. So yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna kind of comment on is I really love back bends, but I feel like I do need to kind of get into the shape quite a few times. So I like to almost like rotate the body. So you're going against gravity in different ways. So like from maybe a bird and then upside down. So it kind of activates in different ways. And then exactly like you said, not just focusing on the spine, but like hip flexors, stretching into there, getting the quads fired, getting the arms fired, so almost moving down the body. So yeah, I agree with whatever and you were saying, definitely.
Awesome. Caro, thanks, Lauren. Caro?
I just had, I mean, maybe epiphany would be a bit of a big word, but from Catherine's comment, like how would Cobra help Urdhva Dhanurasana, it just popped into my mind, like looking at shapes that often you would think if you take Dhanurasana, like lying on your belly, it's kind of the same shape as Urdhva Dhanurasana, and it's even got the same name. But thinking about it, it's actually not. Actually, like Dhanurasana would probably be a lot more related to something like Ustrasana, camel pose, because it doesn't have that shoulder flexion. So I just wanted to share that thought. And
yes, that's a great epiphany. Yes, yes, yes. They're so different in every way. All right. Okay, so yeah, so I think overall with back bends, find all sorts of ways, and it always depends on the back bend, which pose you're doing. So a few back bends to help warm up and build strength, fantastic. But don't forget, it's also a lot to do with shoulders if you've chosen one of those big back bends. And let's help warm up shoulders as well, especially if they're big ones like Urdhva Dhanurasana, full wheel, pushing up. I mean, that's often the biggest restriction with these back bends. And some lateral spinal movements are helpful also to warm up the spine, and a few little twists. So we can bring in a few more movements when it comes to back bends. All right. Okay, so you're with me on how we want to move more progressively through our sequences, and this is why it's easier for you guys to choose a more intermediate pose so that you can work kind of small shapes, building to bigger shapes, building to your biggest shape. So really think of how you can progressively move through your sequence and making sure that your prep poses aren't harder than your actual peak pose. And that's harder when you guys have chosen a slightly more basic kind of shape, like a basic kind of pose, then you haven't got as much to work with. So for the sake of learning how to do all this peak pose sequencing, it's helpful to take quite a punchy pose so you have more to kind of work with and break it down. And remember, you can always then dial that back for beginners classes and beginners peak poses as well. Okay. And what I'll be mostly looking through are those 12 to 16 poses. So you can show me how you've really broken down your peak pose into flexion or extension, and showing actions where your leg is in front and actions where your leg is in back, and not necessarily bringing in shapes that aren't going to help you into the pose. Sometimes warrior two, side angle, reverse warrior, our classic kind of vinyasa flows aren't always helpful to get us into a peak pose. So it might just bring you a little bit out of your comfort zone a little bit and think a little bit differently, but that's exciting. anything else you want to share or talk about when it comes to our sequencing? Yeah. Okay. So we spoke a lot about our forward bend sequences, and we've been chatting on email, and we were looking at, you haven't got a lot of peak poses to work with, but we had standing splits, we had full splits, we had our Padangrustasana versions, holding our big toe, taking leg out to the side. So in a lot of those shapes, it was mainly focused around your hamstrings, right? And finding ways to warm and prep hamstrings to move into big forward bend poses. Firdaus, hi.
Actually, I think you, you basically just said it, but that was one of the challenges I found. There's not a lot of big peak poses in forward bends, right? And so even when, like you said to me, standing splits, I thought like, oh, that's kind of like beginnerish. Like, I'm not going to do that as my peak pose, but anyway, you told me to, so I did. But it was like, are there any more advanced forward bend peak poses, or would that be as much as we go is up to like big hamstring extension?
If we want to just keep it as kind of forward bend peak pose, those are the ones you'll use. You'll see we actually use it a lot in arm balances. We'll use, like we did our hurdlers pose one day. So then you can kind of, it moves, you take all those forward bends and put them into arm balances and inversions as well. So if you're doing a handstand sequence or a headless headstand sequence, you're pretty much doing a forward bend sequence, talking a little bit more about shoulders and arms, and those kind of kicking and leaning forwards and fear actions would also be a forward bend sequence. So it just goes a little bit further and more blends into arm balances and inversions as well. And I think it's also quite tricky. You guys are also having to really categorize your poses. So when it was forward bends, we have those options. When we're looking at back bends, okay, all of us, there's quite a lot of back bends to choose from. But next you're going into twists. So now you're really categorizing all these poses, you know, into, okay, twist category, I'm going to be focusing on this kind of action, this kind of shape, this kind of prepping. Where back bends, you're going to slowly develop a little bit of like a formula around prepping in certain pose categories. Does that make sense? So I think a lot of the time, you guys message me your options of poses, and they were more of a external rotation arm balance pose than a forward bend. So I said, well, okay, we'll save that for your arm balance sequence. Or you wanted to send me twists in your forward bend poses. And I said, okay, we'll save that for twists. So now you're kind of having to break down all these poses into categories as well, which has been quite interesting. Okay. So we've chatted a little bit about our forward bend classes, and I've sent you some feedback. And we've chatted a little bit about back bends and how we're working in a back bend sequence, which might be a little bit different as we're talking about shoulders and a few rotation and lateral flexion. Do you have any other questions regarding your sequences? Okay. And making sense how we want to work progressively, how starting with a smaller pose and then building it up. Yeah. Okay, so those are just the main highlighted points I wanted to chat to you guys about today. Claire.
This is actually just a comment, if it helps anyone else in the group, but I found what helped me in terms of that progression was to actually sit down, and I'm just having a look at my little pictures here to see whether I can find it. So I started with my peak pose on the one end. I don't know whether anyone here can see that. So I started with the peak pose and then worked down, if that makes sense. And that helped me sort of get it in my brain. Okay, this is how I want to end. Okay, I can slip in. Okay, this is the more simple one. Put it up here, put it down there, shimmy them around. And that helped a lot. So starting at the end, working backwards. If that helps anyone, I don't know.
I think that's great, Claire. So Claire started off first with a very easy forward bend pose, and I said, no, choose something harder. And then she went to the extreme version and chose a really hard one. which was great because by the end of it you had it waxed. So Claire chose that super soldier pose. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. It's quite complex. So basically it's a standing split. In standing split, you've got your shoulder wiggled underneath your thigh, and then with the same hand you're holding the opposite foot in a quad stretch. So I said to Claire, okay, well, let's break it down. It's basically a standing split, first of all. Okay. Then we got our shoulder wiggled underneath the thigh, and then we're holding in a quad stretch. So as you say, Claire, and then from there, from those big kind of shapes, then you can break it down. Okay, standing split actions. Okay, having my leg over my shoulder actions, and then quad stretching actions. So it was actually really fun. And hard. Oh, awesome. So I agree, starting with your big pose and just breaking it down, tearing it apart works really, really well. Yeah. Anything else you guys would like to add and share? I must say your back bend sequences coming in today have been looking great. Lauren.
So I just wanted to, and I spoke to Catherine about this yesterday, about doing, so traditionally, obviously in tradition you're taught to put a back bend with a forward fold, like an extreme. So I know traditionally it's taught to do wheel and then you go up and over into your shoulder stand and your halasana, which freaks me out so much. But I know that there are so many teachers that are still teaching that kind of counter pose. I don't know if any of you guys are still teaching that in your thoughts, but like, so I know that some of my students actually really like it. So like, they obviously can't get into the full sort of extent of what someone like I can. So I obviously get the full of that and then the full forward fold. So my back hates it, but I know that there are some of my students which constantly ignore me and they will still go into halasana after a wheel and it freaks me out and I literally have to go and like shout at them under my breath. So I just wanted to, I don't know, just bring that topic up and see what all of you guys are thinking about that and if you still teach that.
So how do you guys feel about that? Any comments? What are your views? Because I was trained completely differently, so I'd love to hear from different perspectives. Come on. Eva?
Yes, I had not been told to do that as well. But I heard about this, this reasoning to always counterbalance poses. I don't see the real sense in it. I always like to include some kind of, like if I do a back bend, I also like to include a forward bend, but it doesn't have to be right afterwards as a counter pose. And it might be nice to do it at the end of class, so that you have more or less all movements of the spine included in the class. But if you're doing a peak pose sequencing, it doesn't have to be right after the big peak pose for me, especially not like then the other extreme, shoulder stand, which I actually never teach at all. So I'm not doing it if you ask for that.
Carrie, did you want to add something there as well? And then we'll come to you for those.
Yeah, like, I mean, I already put it in the chat. I've never heard of that transition, to be honest. And just listening to it for my body definitely sounds way too extreme, because already for me, like when I'm in shoulder stand and then sometimes I go into halasana is like a very intense stretch for me, for my back. Like I can really feel the pulling in my upper back there, and it's super intense for me. And just imagining going into that right from like a deep back bend has me cringing. So I wouldn't teach that, but it's interesting to hear that apparently it is a common thing in maybe that's South Africa or is certain styles of yoga. I don't know. I've never heard it actually. But
it's not, so I don't ever teach it, but it's, what tradition is it, Laura? I'm sure you'll know. Is it, I want to say Jibum, I don't know, but it's definitely like a sequence that people are taught, like to do that and then that, and it's very, and it freaks me out that people are still teaching that, because it's just like, if you thought about it exactly like you say, if you think about it for a second, you're just like, oh no, don't do that.
Firdaus, do you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to actually ask Lauren if part of what I've seen a lot of, and I kind of concluded that it's just like a laziness, especially in Cape Town, of Cape Town yoga teachers who repeat everything everybody else does. And so what they'd always do, it would always be shoulder stand, halasana, ear pressure pose, fish pose, shavasana. Always, always, always. Like every single class I went to in like 2017 or whatever would end like that. And that became like the super trend of the year. The same way, like at some point it became warrior 2, reverse triangle, full triangle, half moon. Every single studio taught that all the time. And I wonder if it's not like just that people are not creative enough. And so they're just deferring to these very, very common things, or like Catherine says, Ashtanga primary series. But also I find it really difficult to get from shoulder stand into halasana, not Kara said the upper back, but I find it in the lower back. Like my lower back just doesn't want my legs to go that far behind my head.
Yeah. Taryn?
Yeah, I just wanted to get some clarity on that, because I think it also comes down to that kind of the thing, like the theme we've been talking about with the fear cueing. So like, don't go into a forward bend once you've done a back bend, like it's so not allowed. And I think that also it kind of confuses me then, because I mean we've just spoken about how we're going to warm into the spine by doing extension and flexion for a big back bend. So like surely doing forward bends isn't going to actually injure if you sequence like the more of a fear cueing than an actual anatomical don't do it kind of thing.
Absolutely. That was such an awesome conversation to have. And I'm glad we're chatting about it. Thanks, Taryn. Roxy, you were next.
Hello, yes, to add on Taryn, I've been to a couple classes where you're doing a camel, and then straight after the teacher would tell you, don't go into your child's pose or embryo pose. It's like really bad to do that after camel. And I think it's quite subjective again, because for me, like my body literally craves to do the counterbalancing pose in everything I do. Like if I would do a seated forward fold, my body urge afterwards plank to really kind of like lengthen the front part of my body after a spinal flexion. Or if I do a camel, then I feel like I want to be doing an embryo pose or child's pose after to round my back. So for me, in my body, I absolutely love the counterbalance. I don't necessarily teach it, because again, I think from all the teachers having this fear of not doing the counterbalancing pose after,
Roxanne, I'm struggling to hear you a little bit. Can everyone hear Roxanne okay? So just
that you have done, but it's interesting because for me,
okay, Roxy, we're going to come back to you because it seems to be glitching a little bit. But I think what Roxy is trying to get across
doing the opposite of
Is
what I've just done before.
it sometimes it feels nice to bend
It
backwards,
feels like I get more release.
and absolutely
from
brings
it.
us back to our fear instructions as well, hey? Thanks, Roxy. I hope we got what you were trying to say there. We'll come back to you. Caro?
Since we're talking about things that some teachers seem to do, I was wondering what you think of doing the inversion at the very last thing in class. This is something that I have witnessed in basically, I had like a 1-month Jivamukti trial, and they always do it, like the very last pose in class is like a headstand or shoulder stand or any inversion. And I also see it in some other teachers. They basically do like a full class, and in the end they're like, okay, so now is the time to do an inversion, so you can do whatever you like. I'm going to come into my tripod headstand, but you can do whatever you like. And I think in general, like for me, it does not make a lot of sense to put an inversion that requires a certain amount of strength, like a headstand, and also focus and energy at the very end when you've already went through like a 60 or 75 or 90-minute class. But I was wondering how what your opinions were on that topic. Like for me, a headstand would be more kind of like a peak pose somewhere in the middle of a sequence, but not the last pose of a class.
Does anyone else have anything to add? So I don't think it's necessary. It depends who you're teaching. I think it always boils down to it, because if you're teaching very experienced practitioners, bending forwards and bending backwards, they do this all the time. It's not going to be dangerous. It's not necessarily going to be a bad thing because they do it all the time. Right? So for me, I'm happy to go into full wheel and then bend forwards. And I don't know if you saw Catherine, that always brings me back. Catherine puts her foot behind her head and then does full wheel. So I think it always depends on the people that you're teaching. And if you're teaching beginners that maybe spend all day at a desk and they don't move a lot, maybe moving them in one direction is helpful so they can warm specific parts of their body and be able to do that peak pose. Right? I also don't think it's bad then making them do something else, but don't expect them to be able to do an epic full wheel for the first time after doing an hour of forward bending. You know what I mean? So it depends. And I think it's helpful to move people in one direction so they really learn not only about warming their body in that shape, but learn the actions, learn the shapes, learn and actually teach them how to do the pose. Because a lot of the time in vinyasa classes, you're moving through so many poses that you're not actually learning how to do anything. It's just being called out warrior 1, warrior 2, side angle. No one's actually learning anything. But by breaking down a pose like you're doing now, you're really teaching each component of the pose and then putting all those pieces together. So they walk away really having learned how to do a peak pose. And for beginners, sometimes it's helpful to move them in one direction. And for me, I was Iyengar trained for the first bit of yoga in my life, and we only did back bends for like 3 hours. Only back bends, only back bends, only back bends for 3 hours. And then we would only do twists for 3 hours. And we only focused on one category of pose. And that was really intense, of course, as you can imagine. So as I was saying, I also don't have that experience of classes where you go forwards and back, and it's more of an Ashtanga thing as well. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's all movement at the end of the day. But what we're teaching here is teaching the actual pose. And I think that's the benefit in all this. And always depends who you're teaching and what are you teaching, what pose you're teaching. Claire.
Unmuted, yes, okay. So I suppose it's more of an opinion because it's actually, I suspect, something that I must bug Catherine with. But is there actual benefit or purpose to doing vinyasa classes? You know, I was trained in Hatha, so I do all my classes actually very slow and chill. The whole point is to bring awareness into the body and focus and whatnot. And when you're going into vinyasa style focus or classes, it's, again, you're just moving and moving. Like I do Ashtanga occasionally, but I noticed, you know, Ashtanga, I end up hurting myself because you're not as in your body awareness as you are when you're doing things slower. And even with the sort of loading and whatnot, you don't really do that in vinyasa classes. You're just like going boom, 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 sort of just trying to get into cardio. That's how I imagine them anyway. Again, I don't do a lot of vinyasa. But is there actual benefit to doing the vinyasa class versus going more slower, more focused, getting into loading, using your props and I don't know, slowing things down, you know?
It's a big question, and I'm keen to hear what you have to say. Firdousi, do you have something to talk about there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to say two things. The one is what you mentioned, Laura, in that a lot of the modern vinyasa classes, especially like the ones that market themselves as flow or creative flow or anything that has the word flow in it, I think it's just choreography. So it's just people calling out, inhale, do this, exhale, do that. And then to Claire's point, like, I don't know, I think the benefit is you feel nice. You feel like, oh, I've been to a little kind of dance class and your endorphins are up and your heart rate's up. But physically, I don't know if there's a benefit beyond that. But then what I wanted to ask you was that if what we're doing, because I agree with you, like we actually need to be teaching people something rather than just calling out poses. But how would you attract people to come to a class? Like, I don't know if people will come if you say this is going to be a Warrior One class or a whatever, like I'm just now thinking, you know, like you'd make it sound like this class is only going to be about standing splits. I don't know if people would come because people want to be like overachieving and doing all the poses all the time. So I'm just interested to hear thoughts from guys who are teaching a lot. Like, how would you kind of market this?
I think it's all great questions. Lauren, do you have something to add?
So, yeah, I agree with you, Firdousi. I don't think people will come to a specific, like, we are doing this today. Although you do have people that really like to know what they're doing. So a lot of people will ask me before I teach, what are we doing today? And I'm like, you can wait and see. Just because I feel like shouldn't have the way expectations, you know what I mean? Although the way I teach, most people can see where we're going. But with the beginning question, like vinyasa, hate it, not yoga at all. So like, from like someone that's never done yoga before, that like, especially runners cannot do it like a still class. So like, for someone that's a runner that wants to kind of get into stretching or yoga, like I think it's a great stepping stone to get into real yoga, which for me is like the slower, more juicy, actually feel and connect to your body instead of just throwing your body around in these pretty shapes.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. All great points. Eva, you had your hands up, and then we'll come to you, Janine, and then Caro.
Yeah, for me, it's more, I would say there is no what is real yoga. You know, it's the same as with what is the correct alignment. It depends on what you want to teach or what you want to focus on or what type of body you have on so many different things. And so there might be a time and a place for vinyasa as well, and it is yoga for me as well. So like Fido said, running is her yoga, and I totally agree with that. And for some people, a vinyasa class might be yoga. And I'm more on the harder side as well. I like slow classes and I like technique and things like that. But in vinyasa, I love it when people focus on the breath. So if you have a vinyasa class with not a lot of cueing, just even if that word is used in different ways, if it's just flowing with the breath, not choreography, it can just be simple sun salutations and then flowing from one posture into the other, which should be like anatomically thought through, and not for the choreography's sake. Then I like vinyasa class as well, because breath is some of the most fundamental things in yoga as far as I see it as well. So I don't think that there's a right or wrong, even though I have my preferences, but other people might have other preferences. And if the goal of yoga is to clear the mind somehow, some people might access this state of mind easier while flowing through a vinyasa class than holding hatha poses. So I think it's all connected.
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to what is the intention. Why are people coming to yoga? Are they there just to breathe and move and zone out, and they don't even want to, just want to be left alone? Or are they there to learn how to do yoga poses? We all have different intentions behind it. Here, Janine.
I think Eva said exactly what I was going to say, is that I teach really, I don't say this is what I'm going to do. It's a vinyasa class, or it's a slow flow, or it's a fast flow. They come, and whatever we do, they enjoy. So I must say, I find my clients love focusing on individual things, strengthening, let's say, just for warrior one, or strengthening for the splits, or, taking it slow. But it all depends. I mean, I love it all. I wouldn't say one is bad and one is better than the other. It just depends on what you're feeling like for that day.
Yeah. And back to you, Lauren. Caro first. Caro, sorry.
I think there might also be big differences in how yoga teachers interpret vinyasa. Like for me, it's been said a few times that vinyasa, you're moving so fast. And that's confusing to me because like most vinyasa classes that I've been to, and like also my 200-hour teacher training was a vinyasa training. And for me, vinyasa is more about this flowy transitions. But then, for example, when it comes to standing poses, like be it warrior 2, be it warrior 3, standing, whatever you have, goddess pose, it doesn't matter, or seated poses, and even just the transitions, warrior, reverse warrior side angle, we would still hold every position for like 5 to 10 breaths, and sometimes even longer. Like we would be standing there with thighs shaking. And actually spend a lot of time in the poses and a lot of time cueing different aspects of attention, like which muscles to activate and which body parts to focus at. And so I think vinyasa isn't always like vinyasa. Gathering from the feedback here, I get that there's apparently a lot of classes where it's just like breathing in warrior 2, breathing out reverse, breathing in warrior 2, breathing out Parshvakonasana, and then you're somewhere else already. But there's definitely other vinyasa classes that are much slower with a lot more holding, and then I think you can actually work towards a goal if you have this approach.
Yeah.
And then everything is just one breath. I guess it's the meditative state, but that's not my cup of tea, I think, as well.
Thanks,
Can
Cara.
you still hear me?
I can still hear you. Thank you. Back to you, Lauren, and then we'll come to you, Roxy.
Yeah, so I think, Cara, that's exactly the point. I've been to some, and I think for those who are saying, like, especially in Cape Town, you have, and I don't know what it is, if it is in Cape Town, but I feel like that's exactly the intention and how you teach vinyasa. I mean, I do like vinyasa if it's taught well sometimes, and it sounds like you would probably take quite a nice class, Caro, with the holding in between progression and that kind of thing. But you do get some vinyasa teachers that they don't even really cue the breath really well because they don't stay in time with the students, and then you do 1,000 chaturanga vinyasas, and by the time you leave, you almost feel like you've been like windswept instead of actually, yeah. So I think, yeah, not that I don't like vinyasa, I don't like certain teachers of certain styles of vinyasa is probably a better way to say it.
Thanks, Lauren. Roxy?
Can you hear me properly now?
We can hear you now.
Sorry, the internet is quite bad these days here. Just to add on this, I think every yoga serves its purpose. Like I know, for example, some people, they hate the discipline behind yoga. Like they would never go to Ashtanga or Bikram because they already do jobs that are corporate and discipline, and they have the routine. So they love going to Vinyasa, for example, because they never know where they're going to be going next, and they don't have to think. It's one breath, one movement. So they enjoy that kind of freedom fluid. So like you say, it's all about the intention, because if your intention is to really work towards poses and then really understand them, then definitely don't go to a Vinyasa class, because you know you're not gonna master a scorpion pose in one Vinyasa class. But if you are looking to just kind of clear up your mind and just be in that creative state that maybe you can't really access during your daily basis by being in the corporate world, then it's amazing, or vice versa.
Absolutely. Thanks, Roxy. So I think it just really, it depends on the reason why they're coming to class. Some people, are attracted to the fast-paced vinyasa that they can just breathe and move and go through the poses. And where some people want to learn more and want to be slower. It's the same reason why someone will be attracted to yin rather than something like power yoga. So, and at the end of the day, we can't please everyone. People will come to your classes because they like the way you teach and what you have to share. And I also feel that why can't we have it all? Why can't we flow and breathe and get strong, and also have this component of a well thought out sequence that we work towards something? Can we have it all? Is that possible? Can we try? Thanks, guys. Anything else anyone would like to share? I think this is such a cool discussion. Yes, Janine.
You know what's quite nice, and I've done quite a lot of classes like that in Joburg, is they say for the next month, we are going to be working towards, let's say, crane. And every week you do build up poses and strengthening poses to build you up to that peak pose. And that I really enjoy that. So it's vinyasa, but building up in sections every week. So over a course of 4 weeks.
Lovely. And I think because a lot of these poses take longer than an hour to get into, it's not going to happen in one class. So it's lovely running those programs like a, 6 to 8 week program focusing on arm balances or inversions or whatever it is, flexibility programs. And I think when you want to do bigger poses, that's kind of where it's at. And the skill training for these big poses.
Yeah, and I mean, that people just love knowing that they're learning something. So they're coming for 4 or 6 weeks and they're getting somewhere. We're breaking it down and we're strengthening. Every week you're doing something different. It really does work well.
Sounds great. I'm just reading your comments in the chats here. Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is what Catherine is saying. I think if teachers really taught the actual poses, like just how to do crow, and we'd have a lot less people on our 200-hour teacher training just wanting to learn how to do the pose, because they just want to know how to do a good triangle, and they just want to learn how to balance on their hands for the first time. So, yeah, absolutely. We can try and bring all those components into our classes. Why not? All right. Thanks, everyone. If there's anything else you would like to add, please share.
Sorry, I need a doctor. My son has just cut his finger off.
Oh, bye.
Let me see that. Let me see. Oh my God. Come, let's go. Let me just turn this off.
Good luck, Janine. Oh my gosh. Shame. That was hectic. Well, on that note, I will be chatting to you all on email with your sequences. So we'll chat more and go into more detail. We'll check in that Janine is okay later. Thanks all for sharing, and that was a great chat. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Hi, Catherine.